As you may know, we're pretty big fans of the Ruth Stout method of deep mulch gardening, which means we tend to talk a lot on this channel about hay. And as a result, we tend to receive a lot of comments about straw. You see, over the years, many people have asked questions like, when you say hay, don't you actually mean straw? And then when we've clarified, many others have said, wait, aren't they the same thing? Because from what I can tell, many people understandably don't realize that there's even a difference and assume that the words hay and straw can be used interchangeably. Likewise, many do know that there's a difference, but aren't sure what the difference actually is. And finally, many others know quite a lot about hay and straw, but believe that only one of them can or should be used in the garden, and therefore assume that we must be talking about straw rather than hay. So in this video, I'd like to quickly explain what each of these mulches are, how they're different, and why we use one over the other. Plus, and perhaps most importantly, I'll also go over some quick disclaimers and safety considerations about their use. Now, jumping right into it, this is hay and this is straw. When placed side by side, you can see that they look pretty darn similar. But there are some subtle differences. For example, hay often has a bit more of a greenish tinge, whereas straw is usually more on the yellow or gold side. Plus, the stalks of hay are often fairly thin, whereas the stalks of straw are usually a bit thicker. And finally, hay often contains a variety of stalks, leaves, seed heads, and other types of plant matter, whereas straw is usually more uniform and typically made up of only one type of plant. But you may notice that I'm relying heavily on words like often, usually, and typically, and that is done on purpose, because both hay and straw are natural products, and so their composition can change depending on when, where, and why they've been grown and harvested. As a quick rule of thumb, try to remember that on a farm, hay is grown for use as animal feed, whereas straw is primarily used for animal bedding. Of course, in our case, we're really only concerned with their uses in the garden, but remembering their original purpose will help to understand their differences. You see, since hay is grown for animal feed, in most cases, at least a bit of biodiversity is considered a plus. So when planted, hay fields will often contain a mixture of grasses like ryegrass, timothy, fescue, Bermuda, orchard grass, etc., and sometimes legumes like alfalfa and clover. But hay can also be harvested from naturally occurring fields, in which case they can contain various wildflowers as well, not to mention any other plants that happen to be growing alongside them. In fact, that's the case for most of the hay that we use in our garden, because we generally get it from neighboring farmers that harvest it from their natural meadows. To them, it's just a general purpose food for their various types of farm animals, and so what grows naturally in the field is all they really need. But many other farmers grow hay for sale, and in that case may prefer one seed mixture over another, depending on their market. Now, straw, on the other hand, is a bit different because farmers don't really plant straw fields. You see, straw is actually a byproduct of cereal crops like wheat and oats, and is made from the dried stalks that are left over once the edible grains have been removed. So in both hay and straw, the plants are cut, dried, and usually baled. And since oats and wheat are also types of grasses, you could say that both are primarily made from the same family of plants. But while hay retains all of the nutritious foodstuff, straw does not. It's kind of like comparing the branch of an apple tree that's bursting with fruit to another branch later in the fall once all of the fruit have been picked. Both come from the same type of tree, and there's still plenty of things you can make with an empty branch, but a delicious apple pie is not one of them. But luckily for the grain farmers, while straw isn't edible, it sure is comfortable. You see, thanks to all those hollow stems, straw makes for a fluffy bedding material that insulates animals from the cold, wet ground. Hence, a waste product becomes a byproduct. Okay, but now back to using hay and straw as garden mulch and why you might choose one over the other. So first of all, both options provide insulation from extreme heat and cold. Both shade the soil and assist with moisture retention, and both smother out existing weeds and prevent new seeds from blowing in and reaching the surface below. But from what we can tell, there are still three primary differences. First, while straw tends to blow around a lot in the wind, hay quickly forms a tangled mat that helps it stay in place. This may sound like a pretty minor difference, but with a large garden on a windy day, the choice you make might just save or create a lot of frustration. Second, since hay is more biodiverse and contains the entire above-ground plant, it is said to provide more nutrients to your soil as it composts in place. Now, we've not personally compared the two from this perspective, but logically it does seem to make some sense. However, I should mention that we also happily use wood chips and sawdust in our garden, so clearly any plant matter will work. And finally, the fact that hay is made up of the whole plant might also serve as a double-edged sword, because part of the plant includes the seeds. And depending on when it's harvested, some or all of those seeds might be viable. Which is why, as a result, we've heard of many gardeners whose gardens quickly became a hayfield. And that's why those who do know the difference generally seem to recommend straw as mulch and never hay. So then, why have we always done the opposite? Well, for starters, we like to follow the Ruth Stout method, and Ruth mostly used hay. Plus, as far as we can tell, the main negative of using hay as mulch, the potential for weed seeds, has never really been a problem for us. At least, not yet. And I think there are probably a few reasons for this. For example, if you add a thick enough layer of hay, any seeds that do germinate at the top won't be able to reach the soil below, and any seeds that germinate at the bottom won't receive enough sunlight. And so in both of those cases, most of the sprouting plants will exhaust themselves before ever taking hold. Plus, we never till in our mulch at the end of the season, and instead just pile the next year's mulch right on top. This ensures that any remaining seeds won't get mixed into the soil, where their survival rate would be much higher. However, it's really important to note that we've never actually tested any of these theories, or at least we hadn't, until this season. Because if you've been following our YouTube shorts, you'll know that earlier this spring I constructed 5 identical raised beds for the sole purpose of comparing hay and straw to see which one results in more weed growth. And honestly, rather than going into any more detail about our theories right now, I think it would be far better to wait until we have some information that's a bit more concrete. So if you're interested, please stay tuned for my full-length video with those final results soon. But the other reason why we usually use hay instead of straw is that sometimes hay is also a waste product. You see, since hay is food, if it gets too old, wet, moldy, or trampled on, it's no longer palatable or useful for animals. But luckily, our garden doesn't have a problem with any of those things. In fact, once it's been spoiled for feed, it's often even better for mulch because it's already partially broken down. Not only does this give us a head start on composting in place, but it also renders any of those weed seeds less viable, or already sprouted and dead. And the best part is that spoiled hay also takes care of the only other negative about using it instead of straw. The fact that it's sometimes more expensive to buy. Because luckily, once it's spoiled, many farmers will happily give it away for free just to get rid of it. But if you'd like more information about how and where we find all the different types of free mulch that we use, please also check out this video that we posted previously. And finally, I mentioned that I'd also cover some quick disclaimers and safety considerations about using hay and straw as mulch, because unfortunately, nothing is ever perfect. You see, since Ruth's time, in many parts of the world, it has become increasingly likely that farmers will spray their crops with herbicides and other chemicals that remain in the hay or straw once it's been baled. Some of these chemicals can be disastrous for your garden and potentially dangerous for your health. So it is incredibly important that you ask questions like where the mulch came from and how it was grown. Plus, there's another health concern that you should be aware of as well. You see, once hay and other mulches become moldy, and especially if it's also very dry at the time, it can release fungal spores into the air when it's pulled apart. And even if the mulch isn't moldy, hay can still release other fine particles as well. It looks like a dust cloud, and it can be pretty harmful if inhaled. Because over a prolonged period of time, exposure to this dust can lead to a condition called farmer's lung, an allergic reaction whose symptoms can range from a temporary shortness of breath all the way up to permanent lung damage. So this is a pretty important warning. Now, though it's most often associated with hay, it can technically occur with any crop, like straw, for example. So if you're working with mulch and notice any mold or dust clouds, it's probably a good idea to wet it first, because that seems to prevent at least some of the dust from rising up into the air. Or far better yet, consider wearing a face mask of some sort to decrease your chances of breathing it in. This is something that Paula and I have begun doing over the past few years, and I definitely recommend it to each of you as well. So finally, I'd really like to reinforce the point that in general, the reason why we talk about hay most often is because we use hay most often. And the reason why we use it is because we can get it. At the end of the day, this channel is really just all about our personal experience and research. So we're certainly not saying that hay is the only option or even the best option. In fact, I've often said that as far as we're concerned, the best mulch is the mulch you have access to. So if that's straw, or wood chips, or fallen leaves, or pine needles, or kitchen scraps, or compost, or indeed hay, no matter what, from what we can tell, any mulch is better than no mulch. They all have their pros and cons, but for the most part, they all serve a similar purpose. So if you have access to several different options, I say go out and experiment and find out which one or which combination works best for you. And then come on back and tell us about it so that we can all learn together. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.